The talk tonight is about St. Augustine, and I know we could call him St. Augustine as well, but I'm from Kansas, and Kansas is a strange place. If you're all familiar with the river that flows in southern Kansas, it's formally called the Arkansas River, but in Kansas we call it the Arkansas River. No joke. So this is St. Augustine, not St. Augustine, though it should be St. Augustine. I just can't get rid of my upbringing. So anyway, today we're going to talk about grace and will in Tolkien's Legendarium, and really the struggle between those two things. And this is one of the great conflicts in all of Tolkien's mythology. And Mike Wallachevich handed me a review today. It was a very interesting review about the movie. And it essentially said that what we're experiencing right now is a nanosecond of culture as we're all interested in Tolkien. And I hope that's not the case, and I really don't think it's the case. Tolkien has been around for 50 years. There has never been a time since Tolkien published The Lord of the Rings that Tolkien has not been popular. It's just now, with Peter Jackson's movies, everyone's really paying attention to him. So he's either popular or extremely popular. And I hope now what we're trying to do, especially as Catholic scholars, is to grab onto Tolkien's legacy and make sure that people understand exactly what he was trying to say, because he was a very deep thinker. This isn't just about elves running around and cleaving the heads of orcs. There's a lot more to this that's in Tolkien. So that's what I want to talk about tonight. So my talk is Grace and Will in Tolkien's Legendarium, an Augustinian understanding, in honor of J.R.R. Tolkien's 11st birthday. In 1958, at a party held by a Dutch bookseller, Tolkien told his audience, and by the way, he very rarely traveled, he hated to travel. He said to this Dutch audience, "I look east, I look west, I look north, I look south, and I do not see Sauron anywhere. But I see that Saruman has many descendants. We hobbits have against them no magic weapons, yet, my gentle hobbits, I give you this toast. To the hobbits, may they outlast the Sarumans and see the spring again in the trees." To Tolkien in 1958, the world must have appeared as though it were in the deepest, darkest winter. Clyde Kilby, an evangelical English professor from Wheaton College, worked with Tolkien in the summer of 1966, trying to help him complete the Silmarillion. Kilby wrote of Tolkien, "Tolkien was an old Western man who was staggered at the direction of civilization. Even our much-vaunted talk of equality he felt debased by our attempts to mechanize and to formalize it. Like many Englishmen, Tolkien feared a world divided in two, in which the smaller peoples of Europe and the rest of the world would be swallowed. Only 15 years earlier, in reaction to the Tehran Conference of 1943, Tolkien had written, "I heard of that bloodthirsty old murderer, Joseph Stalin, inviting all nations to join a happy family of folks, devoted to the abolition of tyranny and intolerance. I wonder, if we survive this war, if there will be any niche left of sufferance left for reactionaries like you and me. The bigger things get, the smaller and the duller and the flatter the globe gets. It is getting to be one blasted provincial suburb." Soon, Tolkien feared, America would spread its, quote, sanitation, morale pep, feminism, and mass production throughout the world. For Tolkien, neither corporate consumer capitalism nor communism, both of which he considered radical forms of materialism, seemed particularly attractive. He was a man who loved devoutly England, and certainly, as he put it, not Great Britain. He was a man who loved monarchy, according to medieval conventions, and he once said, "If I ever hear anyone use the word statist in a positive sense, I would allow him to say it once. If he said it again, I would put him up against the wall and shoot him." He was joking, but there was a serious sentiment there. Indeed, as was St. Augustine, as the barbarians tore through the great gates of Rome on August 24th, 410 at midnight, Tolkien looked out over a ruined world, a world on one side controlled by the ideologues, and consequently a world of the gulag, of the killing fields, of the Holocaust camps, and of total war. And yet on the other side, he saw a world of the pleasures of the flesh, of admen, and of the democratic conditioners to be found especially in education and in government. Both East and West, as Tolkien believed, both had become dogmatically materialist, though in radically different fashions. And yet, in almost every single way, the devastation of Tolkien's 20th century world was far greater than St. Augustine's 5th century world. At least barbarian man believed in something, something that was greater than himself. One could confront the barbarian as a man who knew who he was and what he believed, however false those beliefs might be. C.S. Lewis, Tolkien's best friend, once said, "I sometimes wonder whether we shall not have to reconvert men to real paganism as a preliminary to converting them to Christianity." 20th century man, led by fanatic ideologues, used state-sponsored terror to murder nearly 200 million persons in the 20th century. That is a figure that does not include those killed during war. Those are states, Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, those are states actually killing their own citizens. 200 million. War in that same century claimed only 38.5 million. Think about the difference there. 200 million being killed by governments, 38.5 million being killed in legitimate warfare. Simply put, the blood ran frequently and deeply between 1914 and Tolkien's death in 1973. And despite the 15th century separating the lives of the two men, Tolkien's own worldview closely paralleled that of St. Augustine's, and the attentive reader finds much in common with the City of God and Tolkien's larger mythology. Tolkien would have received his understanding of St. Augustine from his boyhood upbringing in the Birmingham Oratory, founded by the most famous 19th century convert to Roman Catholicism, John Henry Newman. After Tolkien's mother passed away in 1904, Father Francis Morgan, a priest at the Oratory and a very close friend of Newman's, became Tolkien's legal guardian. Certainly, St. Augustine had influenced Newman in a number of ways. In his Apologia, for example, Newman admitted that, quote, "the main Catholic doctrine of the warfare between the city of God and the powers of darkness had been deeply imposed upon him." To Newman, 19th century classical liberalism and philosophic utilitarianism were the harbingers of a secular, modern city of man. And God, according to Newman, would not stay his wrath. Quote, "a confederacy of evil, marshaling its forces from all parts of the world, organizing itself, taking its measures, enclosing the Church of Christ as in a net, is preparing the way for a general apostasy from the Church itself." Newman wrote this in 1838. Though the cardinal never lived to see his own fears realized, Tolkien did. Tolkien even experienced the horrors of modernity firsthand in the trenches at the Battle of the Somme, reportedly the worst battle in World War I. Tolkien wrote, "Dreadful as the dead marshes had been, and the arid moors of the no-man's land, more loathsome far was the country that the crawling day now slowly revealed to his shrinking eyes. Even to the mirror of dead faces, some haggard phantom of green spring would come, but here neither spring nor summer would ever come again. Here nothing lived, not even the leprous growths that feed on rottenness. The gasping pools were chalked with ash and crawling muds, sickly white and gray, as if the mountains had vomited their filth, the filth of their entrails upon the land about. High mounds of crushed and powdered rock, great cones of earth fire-blasted and poison-stained, stood like an obscene graveyard in endless rows, and only slowly revealed in the reluctant light." It is a stunningly disturbing and yet beautiful passage. When C.S. Lewis wrote this, he said this is exactly what trench warfare was like in World War I. This is a passage about Frodo and Sam and Gollum crossing the Dead Marshes on their way to Mordor. Certainly, and Tolkien admitted in the last few years of his life, this was his own experience in the war. Pretty terrifying. Though about Frodo and Sam passing through the Dead Marshes, this passage reveals much about Tolkien's firsthand experiences with inhumane brutality and with modernity. It was indeed there, in the trenches of World War I, that Tolkien first conceived of his larger mythology, a mythology that took up his entire adult life. He wrote to his son Christopher, then serving as an RAF pilot in World War II, "I sense amongst all your pains, some of which are merely physical, the desire to express your feeling about good, about evil, about fair, and about foul in some way. You need to rationalize it. You need to prevent it from festering. In my case, my own anger in the war generated Morgoth." If you've read the larger legendarium, Morgoth is the devil. The mythology that Tolkien created, or as he preferred, discovered it, contained numerous Augustinian insights. One of the most important theological contributions of St. Augustine, and of course they were many, was his sanctifying of Plato's understanding of the two realms. There is the perfect celestial realm, and then the copy, the corrupt copy that we all live in. For Plato, though, the two realms rarely meet, and only then on very mystical occasions. For St. Augustine, though, one could readily not separate the two cities, the city of God from the city of man, in any kind of strict dualism or profound opposition. St. Augustine wrote, "These two cities are entangled together in this world and intermixed until the last judgment affect their separation." Indeed, for St. Augustine, Christians live in the city of man, but exist as pilgrims in this world as citizens of the city of God. What separates citizenship from the city of man with the city of God is an understanding of love. Both men in the city of man as well as men in the city of God, love, but they love radically different things. St. Augustine said, "It is love that separates the two cities, that is, a proper understanding of love, as well as a prideful, false understanding of nature and the significance of love. It is these understandings that divide this world from the next. Two cities have been formed by two loves, the earthly city by the love of self, even to the contempt of God, and the heavenly city by the love of God, even to the contempt of self." St. Augustine argued, "The former, in a word, glories in itself, the latter glories in the Lord." For Augustine, the wholesome God intertwined himself in history, not only through the deepest profundity of the incarnate Word, but also through the actions of angels and even regular men and women chosen by God to do His will and to perform His miracles. For St. Augustine, eternity and time readily mixed after the Incarnation, the former informing history at its deepest levels. But unlike St. Augustine's more Platonic cities, Tolkien posited three cities: the city of God, as represented by the Fellowship of the Ring, the city of man, as represented by Orthanc under the rule of Saruman, and because this is in a mythical rather than in a historical time, a third city, that of the devil, the Tower of Barad-dûr under Sauron. The city of the devil. The leader of the mythical diabolical city, Sauron, like all creatures, started well. "For nothing is evil in the beginning," Elrond states at his council. Beginning well, Tolkien wrote, at least on the level that while desiring to order all things according to his own wisdom, he still at first considered the well-being of the inhabitants of the earth. But he went further than human tyrants in pride and lust for domination, for he is an angel with an angelic immortal spirit. Sauron in the Silmarillion is originally a Maya who had followed the lead rebel devil, Morgoth. Sauron eventually became the first and the greatest of all evils, having initially served as Morgoth's lieutenant. His master Morgoth was indeed incredibly powerful. Like his non-mythological equivalent, Satan, Morgoth too was good by God's grace and wicked by his own will. Indeed, Iluvatar, and Iluvatar is Tolkien's elvish name for God, Iluvatar gave more gifts than any other entity to Morgoth, and yet Morgoth craved only more. Rather than singing Iluvatar's song at the creation of Arda, he desired to create his own and become a god himself. His pride proved his undoing, and after his rebellion, Morgoth thrives on enslavement and on destruction. As Tolkien put it, his entire dominion was nothing but torment. The whole of creation had been marred by Morgoth, Tolkien wrote. Morgoth was not just a local evil on earth, nor a guardian angel of earth who had gone wrong. He was the spirit of evil, the master of lies. And everything that he had done was to introduce evil into the actual matter of creation itself. Morgoth and Sauron represent the two most concentrated manifestations of evil in Tolkien's legendarium, but others certainly abound. We know that there are dragons, there are balrogs, werewolves, orcs, goblins, half-orcs, ringwraiths, wights, hounds of hell, vampires even make an appearance in the Silmarillion, wargs, wolves, and trolls, to name only a few of the evils. With Morgoth chained in the void at the end of the First Age, Sauron remains the only concentrated manifestation of evil. As Tolkien wrote, he was a problem that man would have to deal with finally. The evils of Sauron, Gandalf laments, can never wholly be cured, nor made as if they had not been, but to such days we are doomed. The city of man. Saruman in his Tower of Orthanc represents the city of man. The Valar and the Valar, the archangels in the legendarium. The Valar had originally sent Saruman, also Amaya, a second-order angel, to Middle-earth to help its inhabitants battle against evil. Saruman indeed arrived as the greatest and the most skilled of the 5 Istari, and Istari is Tolkien's word for the wise. It's an order of angels. The Istari, the wise. Each of the 5 were incarnate angels who were sent by God, by the Valar, to aid men and elves. But from nearly the moment of his arrival at the Grey Havens in Middle-earth, pride crept into Saruman's soul, as he became jealous that Círdan, the gatekeeper at the Grey Havens, gave Gandalf, who was regarded as the least of the 5 Istari, Narya the Red, the elven ring of fire. The purpose of this ring was to kindle in the hearts and minds of all elves and all men courage. In Saruman's heart, however, the gift of the ring only worked mischief, as the wisest and most skilled of the Istari begrudged the gift to someone lesser than himself. And as Tolkien wrote, this was the beginning of the hidden ill will that he bore towards Gandalf, which afterwards would become manifest. For rather than humbling himself for the good of all men and all elves, Saruman thought only of himself and the glory that he could bring to his own power. St. Augustine reminds us, the earthly city, which does not live by faith, seeks an earthly peace. And the end it proposes, in the well-ordered concord of civil obedience and rule, is the combination of men's wills to attain the things which are helpful for this life. In the earthly city, the princes and the nations they subdued are ruled by love, but it is the love of ruling. To secure his peace in the city of man, Saruman turns to studying the dark arts, by which he becomes almost wholly corrupted. It is perilous to study too deeply the arts of the enemy for good or for ill, Elrond warned. And indeed, as Saruman's knowledge, and it's critical this is knowledge, as his knowledge of Sauron's ways grows, so grows his pride. And who are the citizens of Orthanc, the citizens of this city? Well, the citizens of this city are nothing more and nothing less than orcs. An orc in Anglo-Saxon means demon. The orcs in the mythology are corrupted and tortured elves. The shadow that can bred them can only mock. It cannot make, not real things of its own, Frodo assures Sam. I don't think it gave life to the orcs. It only ruined and twisted them. And if they are to live at all, they have to live like other living creatures. Foul waters and foul meats they'll take, if they can get no better, but never will they eat poison. Still, as we read in The Lord of the Rings, the orcs seem to have fallen quite far, as the Eucharistic lembas terrifies them, and they most eagerly eat man flesh whenever it presents itself to them. Indeed, the orcs despise all beauty, and they glory in all mechanization. As Tolkien wrote in The Hobbit, one of my favorite passages, now goblins, and goblins are just mountain orcs, now goblins are cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. They make no beautiful things, but they make many clever ones. They can tunnel and mine as well as any but the most skilled dwarves, and when they take the trouble, though they are almost always untidy and dirty. Hammers, axes, swords, daggers, pickaxes, tongs, and any instrument of torture they make very well. Or they get other people to make them by their design, prisoners and slaves who have to work until they die without the benefit of air or light. It is not unlikely that they invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices for killing large numbers at once, for wheels and engines and explosions always delight the orcs. Still, Tolkien concluded, the orcs, like all creatures except for Satan, are ultimately redeemable. He wrote in 1954, "They are fundamentally a race of rational, incarnate beings, and though horribly corrupted, they are no more so corrupted than most men I meet on the street today." To increase his own power, Saruman selectively crossbreeds orcs and men to create the bloody and vengeful Uruk-hai. Additionally, he turns to industrial mechanization. He is plotting to become a power, says Treebeard. He has a mind of metal and of wheels, and he does not care for growing things except for how they will serve him at the moment. And the land around Isengard, once forested and lush, has been destroyed by Saruman's minions. As the Ents attack Isengard, they discover Saruman's treasuries, storehouses, armories, smithies, and great furnaces, iron wheels revolving there endlessly, and hammers that never cease thudding. At night, plumes of vapor steam from the vents, lit from beneath with a red light, blue light, and even venomous green. With the perversion and attempted domination of both creatures, the orcs and the Uruk-hai, and nature with the development of industry, Saruman has become, in essence, a modern man. And he too has fallen back on the first sin, the sin that leads to all others. You too shall be as gods. But of course, as we all know, the serpent lied. Tolkien wrote, Saruman had slowly shaped all things to his purpose, and he tried to make them better, at least he thought so, but he had been deceived. For all the arts and the subtle devices for which he forsook his former wisdom, notice knowledge is replacing wisdom here, for which he forsook his former wisdom, and which fondly he imagined were his own, came only from Mordor. So that what he made was not only a copy, a child's model, a slave's flattery, of that vast fortress, armory, prison, furnace of great power, Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower, which will suffer no rival and which laughs at flattery, biding its time, secure in its pride and in its immeasurable strength. Not only will the serpent lie, but the serpent will not be mocked. The city of God. How then does one fight the serpent Morgoth, his servant Sauron, or his many imitators, the Sarumans of the world? The solution for St. Augustine, as well as for Tolkien, was the same. It's incredibly simple, frustratingly so. For Christ had already shown us the way to humble ourselves, to give up our selfish wills, and to become the instruments of God. Just as Christ had humbled himself on the cross, so Augustine said, must we. As St. Augustine wrote, choose now what you will pursue, that your praise may be never in yourself, but only in the true God, in whom there is no error. For of popular glory you have had your share, but by the secret providence of God, the true religion was not offered to you by your choice. Awake, for it is now day, as you have already awaked in the persons of some in whose perfect virtue and sufferings for the true faith we glory. For they, contending on all sides with hostile powers, and conquering them all by bravely dying, have purchased for us this country of ours with their blood, to which country we invite you and exhort you to add yourselves to the number of citizens to this city, the city of God. The church, after all, as St. Augustine knew very well, had been built on the blood of the martyrs. Martyrs such as Saints Perpetua, Felicity, Boniface, Sir Thomas More, John Fisher, Maximilian Kolbe, and the Blessed Miguel Pro. Martyrdom, though, is not the only thing that separates these men and women from the rest of humanity. All true Christians must humble themselves to God, whether in a minor way or in a drastic way, even leading to physical death. But how salvation occurs on an individual level remains a mystery, even within Catholic theology today. And the question regarding the interplay of free will and predestination plagued Tolkien throughout his mythology and throughout his adult life. Though Catholic theology argues that one is saved only by grace and sanctified by works, themselves inspired by grace, the question of how or why an individual originally accepts that God-given faith remains unanswered in any concrete way. It remains, simply stated, something that frustrated me to no end in CCD, a mystery. While the pure Augustinians lean towards the predestinarian side and the pure Thomists towards the free will side, Orthodox Catholicism embraces neither. Neither pure free will nor pure predestination. I'm not sure if that really goes together, but pure predestination. The answer of salvation for the Catholic resides somewhere in the unexplained middle. As the Council of Trent stated in 1547, that they who sin had been cut off from God may be disposed through his quickening and helping grace to convert themselves to their own justification by freely assenting to and cooperating with that grace, so that while God touches the heart of man through the illumination of the Holy Ghost, man himself neither does absolutely nothing while receiving that inspiration, since he can also reject it, nor yet is he able by his own free will and without the face of God to move himself to justice. Clear? Absolutely not. Tolkien wrestled with this great Catholic dilemma in the entirety of his mythology. In a letter to his son Christopher, he wrote, "A soul has free will, but God is, so to speak, behind us, supporting us, and nourishing us at all moments." Specifically, Tolkien believed, and he actually was somewhat of a mystic, maybe something we could talk about later, God graces each of us individually through a personal guardian angel. Faith is an act of will, he told his son Michael, but then he quickly added, but it can only be inspired by love. Additionally, Tolkien wrote, faith is not a single moment of final decision. It is a permanent, indefinitely repeated act. This is very complicated. And while God is always present in The Lord of the Rings, he certainly remains unnamed. And yet when Frodo inquires of Gandalf how Bilbo found the ring, Gandalf answers, behind that, there was something else at work beyond any design of the ring maker. I can put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring and not by its maker. In which case you were also meant to have it, and that may be an encouraging thought. Of course, Frodo doesn't think so at that point, but it is an encouraging thought. Gandalf admits that in Middle-earth, what one calls chance is actually the acceptance of the will accepting Ilúvatar's, God's, design. And as Elrond calls his own council to order, he offers a very important caveat. Called, I say, though I have not called you to me, strangers from a distant land, you have come and are here met in this very nick of time. By chance, it may seem. Yet it is not so. Believe rather that it is so ordered that we who sit here and none others must now find counsel for the peril of the world. One of the most important ways to glorify God and to repay the gift of faith is to discover one's place in the divine economy. That is, one must know that he or she was born in a certain time, in a certain place, for a certain reason, or maybe many reasons. St. Paul wrote about this numerous times in his letters. In his letter to the Christians at Corinth, the first letter, he said, "For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ." St. Augustine concurred. All natures, then, inasmuch as they are and have therefore a rank and species of their own, and a kind of internal harmony, are certainly good. And when they are in the places assigned to them by the order of their nature, they preserve such being as they have received. So very diverse elements then make up the church. And we can look around this room. Very diverse elements make up the church. St. Augustine wrote, "The heavenly city, while it sojourns on earth, calls citizens out of all nations and gathers together a society of pilgrims of all languages, and never scrupling about diversities in their manners, in their laws, and in their institutions. The church, therefore, is so far from rescinding and abolishing these diversities that it even preserves and adapts them, so long only as they provide no hindrance to the worship of the one supreme and true God." So what does all this mean for Tolkien? Well, let's think about the Fellowship of the Ring, this little church struggling against every odd, against every peril as it makes its way across the landscapes of Middle-earth. Can we imagine a more diverse group? An incarnate angel named Gandalf, two men, Aragorn and Boromir, an elf, Legolas, a dwarf, Gimli, and four hobbits? It's pretty diverse, right? The Fellowship of the Ring, then, represents, I believe, the church, traversing the perilous landscapes of Middle-earth, making its way slowly but surely to fulfill the mission of God. It would be impossible, as I just stated, to find a more diverse group. And not only do we have the 9 that are in the Fellowship of the Ring, but we also have a number of others along the way, many of them equally bizarre. Tom Bombadil, we still don't know who he is. Elrond, Galadriel, Theoden, Treebeard, and even unwittingly Gollum. All of these aid in the common mission, the mission to destroy the ring, the great representation of sin. Ultimately, of course, this mission of the fellowship is just one mission among millions. We're all in a story, every one of us. We even think about the word gospel. We translate that poorly now to mean good news. Of course, the word news didn't even come into existence Until the 1880s, it was used by newspapers, right? They wanted a name for themselves, things that are new, the news. What did gospel mean? Well, gospel is a word from 950 from a monastery in England, Lindisfarne, and the monk who invented the word meant it to mean God's spell. It's the story that he weaves. And we think about that from the very beginning. God speaks the universe into existence. The word is made flesh. Right? We are in a story, and Tolkien understood that. We are all in God's story, and we are ultimately the church militant. Let's think about these different members of the fellowship. Gandalf, his real name was Aloran in the True West. As I had already mentioned, he was the least of the Astari to be sent to Middle-earth to aid men and elves in their war against Sauron. Though the least powerful, he was the wisest, and he spent his early days here. Remember, he'd been here about 1,000 years by the time the War of the Ring occurs. He had spent his early days walking among the elves, and I love this. These are Tolkien's words. Unseen or in the form of an elf, but they did not know whence their fair visions or the promptings of wisdom came from that were put into their hearts. This was Gandalf's role. Right? He walked around and he touched people. Right? He physically, mentally, spiritually touched people. The Silmarillion records further. Those who listened to him awoke from despair and put away their imaginations of darkness. It's beautiful. Right? Can we imagine a better thing for an angel to do? Right? Those who listened to him awoke from despair and put away their imaginations of darkness. So as not to become too taken with any one people or place, thus attenuating any temptation to power, Gandalf, of course, becomes the great pilgrim, and he wanders from place to place, and he knows who he is. At his imminent death at the bridge of Khazad-dûm, Gandalf states his place in the created order. As he faces the demonic Balrog, he says, "You cannot pass, for I am a servant of the secret fire. Wielder of the flame of Anor, you cannot pass." The secret fire, Tolkien told Clyde Kilby, was the Holy Spirit. So empowered, Gandalf plunges to his death, but not without taking the demonic Balrog to his doom as well. The men of the fellowship humble themselves. When Aragorn first appears in the story, he does so as Strider, the mysterious ranger who remains untrusted even by those he protects. Yet he quickly reveals himself as the true king of Middle-earth, a descendant of the men of Númenor. He reveals this through his physical and mental prowess, through his never-ending willingness to sacrifice himself for the greater good, and most importantly, remember when everyone recognizes he's the king? It's when he's a healer in the hospitals of Gondor. It's when he heals. Once they recognize that he's a healer, they understand that he's the king. He also, of course, has that great wrestling match in the Palantir with Sauron. That also helps. But even Boromir, who betrays the group because of his pride, finds redemption in self-sacrifice as he attempts to protect Merry and Pippin from the Uruk-hai. As he's dying riddled with orc arrows, he confesses to Aragorn, "I tried to take the ring from Frodo. I'm sorry. I have paid. I have failed." In response, Aragorn takes Boromir's hand and assures him, "No, through your sacrifice, you have conquered." As Boromir's earthly pilgrimage begins, he smiles. Legolas the elf and Gimli the dwarf play vital roles in the fellowship as well. Not only do they offer the skill of the bow and the axe, wit and wisdom, as they seem to endlessly cleave the heads of orcs, but more importantly, they begin the healing process between their two races. Since the awakening of the dwarves, the races had been mutually antagonistic to one another, but now in the Third Age with a common enemy, they must put aside their minor differences to defeat the true foe, and in the process, the two become fast and lifelong friends. The hobbits, I think, play the most interesting role in the fellowship, for they are the least of all creatures in Middle-earth, especially in terms of wielding any kind of political power. An agrarian people, they shun adventure. There were exceptions, of course, in the history of the hobbits. The most important, and one of my favorites, though he's never really written about, is the ancestor of Bilbo and Frodo, a man by the name of Bullroarer Took, who rode a wild boar in battle against the invading orc army some years before the story takes place, The Lord of the Rings. Indeed, when Gandalf seeks a thief to help in Thorin's expedition, he says, I want a dash of the took, and then looking at Pippin, he says, but not too much. But I want a foundation that is solid, a Baggins perhaps. The hobbits, Pippin, Took, and Merry Brandybuck, of course, who are ornery and always getting in trouble in the Shire, they get in trouble for a reason. They are made for something greater. They become the aides to great kings. They were meant for something different. They weren't meant to be farmers. Frodo establishes himself as the suffering servant at the Council of Elrond. As he stands before the council, he says, I will take the ring, though I do not know the way. He trudges through the various terrains of Middle-earth. He's betrayed by Gollum, suffers near-fatal wounds from Ungoliant's spawn, Shelob, and of course suffers the indignities of the orcs who are holding him prisoner at the beginning of the Return of the King. Yet he makes it to the precipice of the cracks of doom before succumbing to the weight of the ring. While Frodo, I believe, offers a means by which to act in a Christ-like fashion, he also offers an example of what not to do. The claiming of the ring at the cracks of doom was really, as Tolkien said, only a very minor sin, for God had never given Frodo the grace to resist that temptation all the way. Frodo's only serious failure, Tolkien wrote, came after he claimed the ring as his own. When Gollum dances for joy into the cracks of doom, carrying the ring with him, Frodo feels stunned that the mission is over and he's still alive. Frodo desires martyrdom, and yet God's task for him is over and he is to live. Martyrdom, Tolkien wrote in his letters, cannot be claimed by the will. It must be accepted only as an acceptance of grace. The divine economy is limited to what is sufficient for the accomplishment of the task appointed to one instrument in a pattern of circumstances and other instruments. To claim more would be to claim the sole right of Christ as the Savior of mankind. In its highest exercise, Tolkien explained, mercy belongs to God alone. So who do we end up with? My favorite, I think the real hero of the whole story, it's told from his perspective. It's Sam. Sam is the real hero of The Lord of the Rings. And when we begin the trilogy, he appears as nothing more than a simpleton. Indeed, his name means the half-wise. This is what Samwise means. And yet, graces flow to Sam as he proves to have the one virtue in spades, and that is the virtue of loyalty. He is Wiglaf to Beowulf. He is Sir Gawain to King Arthur. He is St. John to Jesus. Though Sam would much prefer living the good life, as all hobbits desire, what we'll all enjoy after this talk, a good beer, a good smoke, a well-tended garden, the company of friends, and the fathering of a large family, he knows that only if Frodo's task is accomplished will the hobbits in the Shire ever live in peace, will they ever be able to enjoy the good life. And like a good citizen Republican, Sam puts down his plow and he picks up his sword. He fights the good fight to return to hearth and home. Ultimately for Tolkien, as he wrote, the truest heroism stems from obedience and love, not from pride or from willfulness. This remains true in ordinary as well as in extraordinary life. And Sam is well rewarded with the good life as it's meant to be. If you haven't seen it, there's a great chapter that Tolkien decided not to end The Lord of the Rings with. It can only be found, I think it's in volume number 9 of the History of Middle-earth. Lewis talked him out of publishing it because he said it was sappy and it would ruin the whole story. It's not sappy, it's great, and it would have been the best way to end the story. So if you get the chance, find that. It's very good. We find out a number of things in this story. We find out in this last chapter that God has definitely blessed Sam and Rosie with a whole parcel of children. And more likely, it seems, a number of children are still to arrive. Regular ragtag and bobtail, old Saruman would have called them, Sam says as he looks at his children. Evil, of course, sees children merely as obstacles, but Sam wisely knows that they are essential for the good life. Sam also notes that while Frodo received proper acclaim for his deeds, he himself had received lots of treasures. When King Aragorn writes a letter to Sam almost 20 years after the destruction of the ring, he translates Sam's name in Elvish not properly as half-wise, but instead as fully wise, reflecting Sam's significant growth during and after the destruction of the ring. As Aragorn's letter reveals, Sam has grown from the silly hobbit we see arguing with Ted Sandyman in the Bywater pub to a wise and a virtuous statesman. Perhaps most important, his many children treat him with immense love and respect and acknowledge his authority as father. When Sam speaks, Tolkien writes in this final chapter, his children respond to him as hobbit children of other times had once responded to the wizard Gandalf. Indeed, the adult Samwise carries the authority of an incarnate angel. So on this day, January 3rd, 2003, Tolkien's would have been 111st birthday. What would Tolkien think on this most famous of birthdays, the birthday on which Bilbo departed the Shire? Unfortunately, not much has changed since 1958, when the Dutch honored him. He would look out and he would see Christian persecutions throughout the world. Indeed, if he took tally of all of the killings of the 20th century, of those 200 million people who were slaughtered by their own governments, he would note, as a study revealed this summer, that 65% of all Christian martyrs in the history of Christendom died in the 20th century. Most likely, he would lament that this will continue into the 21st century, as ideologues continue to wage war on the world, a world they desire to order to their own wishes, just as Sauron and Saruman had. Such concentrated evils as Sauron, though, do not readily appear in the world of history. Instead, his numerous servants and false imitators, the Sarumans that Tolkien saw in the east, the west, the north, and the south, seem to be reigning in almost every continent. The city of the devil continues to influence the city of man, the land between heaven and hell, this middle earth. Chaos spreads through pornography, abortion, ideological terror, bureaucratic conditioning, and the general exploitation of the human person created in the image of God. Yet this most pessimistic of Catholics, I'm talking about Tolkien now, not me, would also see immense signs of hope. If the blood of the martyrs of the second and third centuries built the church, perhaps the blood of the 20th century martyrs will bring in converts by the thousands. Perhaps men such as St. Maximilian Kolbe, a priest who willingly traded his life for a father and a husband in that concentrated hellhole known as Auschwitz, have something to teach us. Perhaps. It is an old lesson, of course, but a true one, that only by humbling oneself to the grace of God will the will of God prevail in this world of sorrows, this city of man, this middle earth. Indeed, only a recognition that grace, in the form of the incarnate Word, humbling himself before the world and the universe through his death and resurrection, can make us citizens of the city of God. And what better leader could we have on this earthly pilgrimage than a poet and a playwright, a survivor of the anti-fascist and anti-communist undergrounds, a man who says wherever he goes, echoing Christ, "Be not afraid." These are good things. The incarnate angel of Tolkien's mythology, Gandalf the Grey, put it very well in a conversation early on in the fellowship with Frodo. Frodo laments, "I wish it need not have happened in my time." Gandalf replies, "And so do I, and so do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us." The war, I think we have to acknowledge, is greater than any one of us, but the battle is ours and we must claim it. But we can only do that through the mystery of grace. I want to end with just some beautiful words from Tolkien, from an academic essay he wrote in the 1930s called On Fairy Stories. This is how he concludes it. "The gospel contains a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. These stories contain many marvels. They are artistic, beautiful, and moving. They are mythical in their perfect, self-contained significance. And among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe." Eucatastrophe is the opposite of a catastrophe. It's a good ending. "But this story, Christ, has entered history and the primary world. The desire and aspiration of subcreation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation itself. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. To reject this story leads either to sadness or to wrath. There are no exceptions. Like Frodo, like Aragorn, like Gandalf, like St. Augustine, and like St. Paul, Let us humble ourselves before our Maker through His grace, and may the light of the Logos shine in the soul of each one of us, for we are all here in this time, in this place, for a purpose. Happy birthday, Professor Tolkien.